As watch enthusiasts, there's very few things that we can collectively agree on. One of those things, though, is that we disagree a lot. Whether there is a small change in a date that we'd love to be different, or we don't like the dial color, the way that the branding is positioned on the dial, we don't like the movement choice, we love to debate and find things wrong with watches. But what I want to do in this video is try to bring us all together and look at some watches that I think everybody, almost everybody, collectively really appreciates or can at least respect. So what I'm looking at here are watches that are able to stand out as being like getting the check from pretty much anybody in the industry, from an entry-level individual who's just stumbling into the hobby, or somebody that has been a seasoned collector for decades and decades. So that's really what I'm going for here. I'm gonna be looking at budget options as well as luxury options, so no specific order when doing this. I'm gonna probably bounce around. Also, in addition to that, only one mention per brand, so I don't want to be oversaturated with one brand being mentioned more than others. And as I mentioned, the whole keyword here is almost. So before mentioning each one of these watches or getting into the details why I think it should be included on this list, I'll also talk about why almost and why maybe some people still might have a problem with it, but still collectively more people are going to appreciate it or at least respect it, if not love it. So before we jump into this video, if you want a good jumping off point for your research in that next watch you're looking to buy, we put together a comprehensive guide for some of the top watches in 2022. We pieced some different opinions from people on the team here, put some of my favorite options in there, wide selection of price ranges, so pretty much everybody is represented. So check out the link in the description down below if that sounds interesting to you. I think we have over 100 watches in that article. So now for our first watch on this list, we have the Hamilton Khaki Field. As promised, why almost? Why are there some people that still might not like this watch? Something I'll often hear, maybe if someone is going to put down the Hamilton, is going to be, maybe it's generic looks, but it is a field watch with real, true heritage in that arena of field watch design. Making watches in World War II for the Allied forces, becoming a storied name in American watchmaking until they left the United States in 1969, and still being a powerhouse when it comes to affordable Swiss watchmaking for decades, Hamilton has developed a reputation that is hard to beat for the price segment. Whether you're looking at the Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical with the hand winding options that are probably most true to the original design ethos of a field watch, then moving into the automatic versions that have some sportier upside with 100 meters of water resistance, the titanium, as well as bronze case options if you want a more eclectic case material. You have so many to choose from. And the reason why these watches I think are so loved is because they hit that intersection of value, but also being a definitive watch regardless of value. I think when you think of a field watch, for me at least, I think of Hamilton. Hamilton's one of the first brands that comes to mind. And regardless if you're looking at a $5,000 field watch or a $500 field watch, what I always notice is even if a more expensive field watch does a great job, there's always somebody that was throw the jab of saying, oh, I can get like 10 Hamiltons for that dollar amount. So it's just one of these brands that has just found their lane. They have history, heritage, and then when you look at the end product, the finishing, as well as the movement provided, 80-hour power reserve for many of their watches in this collection, solid water resistance pretty much across the board, at least 50 meters on pretty much every single one, looking at 100 meters at some of the automatic versions. They are just simply classic watches, and I think even if you are somebody that's very seasoned in the collecting world, you still have to say Hamilton makes a pretty cool watch for $500 to $1,000. So now for our next watch, we have the Cartier Tank. And why almost? Why are people maybe not in love with this watch? It could really just come down to the dressy appearance of it, maybe not being able to be as versatile as some other watches, and the rectangular case might be polarizing for some. But this watch is simply iconic. And even if it's not for you, you have to respect what this watch has developed with design roots going back to 1917. And the other thing I like about the Cartier Tank, unlike some other luxury watches out there, is it is pretty well versed in terms of price segments that it occupies. You can get into a tank, depending on, course option, under $3,000, and moving your way up from there, looking at the Cartier Tank Louis, which is my personal favorite, and then jumping up even more, it's just more complicated and eclectic versions of the Cartier Tank. But this watch is just simply timeless, and if a watch can work on the wrist of Princess Diana, Andy Warhol, and Muhammad Ali, I think that's really saying something. For our next addition to this list, and I typically pair these watches together, and it's partially because I think they are the two watches that epitomize this idea of a rectangular case, and here we have the JLC Reverso. The same reasons why almost I think are here as with the Cartier Tank. The rectangular case maybe being too dressy for some, harder to pull off in certain circumstances. But this is equally iconic in my eyes. Maybe not from a dial perspective, but also from a case silhouette standpoint in the chassis system where this thing flips around, there's just nothing that can come close. There's some that will mention the Cartier Basculante, but there's no way that that competes, for, at least compared to this in my eyes. The Reverso case is as timeless as they come. Since 1931, the whole mystique around being created for polo players and then being adapted to kind of being this, like initially a sports watch so that the crystals wouldn't crack, and then turning into this perfect representation of elegance. It just kind of evolved over the years, but still has sustained its core ethos of what it's all about. This is a watch that I don't think is going to be for everybody. Even probably more the case than with the Cartier Tank, because the dial is less of the story when it comes to the Reverso. The case is what makes it so special and unique. Yet even if you are somebody that can't pull this watch off, I've yet to interact with an individual that just detests the Reverso. And if they do, it's just for subjective reasons. Now, from the peak of elegance down to the most rugged watches out there, we have Casio next with the Casio Oak. So these watches, in terms of why almost, I would say there's some snobbery here, and that's probably the main reason why there's gonna be almost. I don't think some people are gonna be in love with an attainable kind of quartz analog watch. But why I do think this one is the most universal of all the G-Shocks, and what I've noticed specifically on just covering G-Shock, this has been the one that seems to have resonated with the most amount of people. Mostly as a byproduct of kind of being a combination of that analog digital display. It bridges the gap for those that love like the Mudmasters, the DW5600 cases. They could still enjoy this. And then on the other side, you have individuals that are all about analog mechanical watches and finding something that could be adapted into a Casio G-Shock type of case. It was just a perfect winning formula. These also are able to be worn on a wide variety of wrists. I think the sizing is quite well done. Even on a large wrist, it's not gonna look completely out of place. And on a small wrist, same can be said there. And on top of that, you have many different features with these watches that also make them quite functional. For our next watch here, we have the Omega Speedmaster Professional. Now, this is no surprise for probably many of you. Let's talk about why almost. Why are the people that might not like the Speedmaster? I think it just comes down to it being ubiquitous. It's mentioned so often, very much like the Rolex Submariner. But why I think this watch has a slight edge compared to something like the Submariner when it comes to being collectively loved more, it's just because I think this watch has been so unchanged. It doesn't have the baggage associated like a Rolex as well when it comes to availability. It just is timeless, and also set the standard when it was unveiled in 1957 that we would see with many sports-oriented chronographs in terms of its display, its register display, as well as the tachometer on the outside fixed bezel that has become a staple for chronographs in pretty much every segment of the market. The Speedmaster is one of the most iconic watches of all time, and even with its ubiquitous stature, I do think whenever I post about it, I talk about the Speedmaster, there's so many people that never really get enough of it. So next we have the Orient Bambino. So why almost? I think this watch has been played out, and of course it's been mentioned over and over again, or at least that's what it feels like for myself. But it's almost become a meme of affordability, and I mean that in a good way. I think when you talk about value for dollar, the Orient Bambino for essentially a decade has been the watch that just has, springs off the tongue more than pretty much anything else outside of maybe some Seiko offerings like the Seiko 5 or SKX. Which has, of course, since changed. Now, Orient recently has changed their prices, but I think even with the price increase, there's still very good value. And I would say that the Bambino for many years was probably maybe undervalued and maybe almost too good for the dollar amount, which I think is why so many enthusiasts loved it. You have automatic movements on the inside with their manufacturer calibers that run with better accuracy range than you will have with many Seiko level movements, as well as Miyota level movements. And then with the wide variety of versions, you pretty much can find one that's going to be right for you. And even if you're way beyond the Bambino, it's like one of these watches that like, hey, I can't hate this thing. Now, I was on the fence whether or not I should include a watch from this brand on the list, but I thought if there was going to be one, this would be the one to choose, simply because I think it is the original and dictated much to come and has sustained itself very similar to the Speedmaster in its own way for this brand, and that's Rolex with the Rolex Explorer. Now, why almost? I think some people are going to associate Rolex with some baggage here, but you also have the availability conversation too. But beyond that, and why I thought it made sense to include this watch on this list, really comes down to this watch has dictated since its creation in 1953 much of that original sports watch DNA from Rolex. If you look at the early Submariner models, the Explorer was what dictated much of the evolution of those watches, and even spawned on another collection with the Explorer 2. And I've also noticed that many of the popular models from Rolex have this polarizing nature to them. When you mention the Submariner, people are going to of course recognize this iconic design, but there's also gonna be many that are going to be so fatigued and tired of what this watch is putting forth within the market. Then you have the same with the Daytona and its trading prices, and also with the auction prices of like something like the Paul Newman. It just seems like it's a little bit more out of touch. And in comparison to the original, they've also changed quite a bit. But when it comes down to the Explorer, this watch is pretty much sustained. And the move back to 36 millimeters in recent years, I think even demonstrates this further, that they are in alignment with what this watch really was supposed to be at the beginning, and they're trying to maintain that as much as they possibly can. It's not about the bling, it's not about really flexing in any way, it's just a good, solid, all-around watch. And whether you're a Rolex fanboy or somebody that doesn't even like Rolex, I think you can respect the Explorer for what it is, as just being a great watch for what it's trying to go for. For our next watch here, we have the Tiso PRX. So why almost? I think it really comes down to this is an inspired design, both from Tissot's archive, but more importantly from other integrated sports watches from the 1970s. So as the history goes, this watch was really a creation and pretty much a one-to-one. When I visited Tissot's headquarters, you could see the original watch was a late 1970s C-Star model, and then they wanted to adopt this into its own line with the PRX. In the last 5 years, I don't think I can think of a watch under $1,000 that has had this crazy, enormous just boom in popularity and ultimately being just beloved and just being impressive once you get it in your hands. Now, of course, we saw the Omega Moon swatch. That was a different story because once you got it in your hands, you recognize that it is a swatch. When you get this watch in your hands, you're like, whoa, this is really well done for the money. And that's kind of Tissot's MO. It's all about just giving you a no-nonsense watch for the money. But with the PRX, I think they outdid themselves. Even with the original Quartz release in early 2021, you're talking about a fantastic watch, integrated bracelet, under $400. People just dig it. And also with integrated sports watches becoming less and less obtainable, a watch like this just made so much more sense than ever. And then having the Powermatic versions being under $700 come out a few months later, they're essentially the best do-it-all style of watches that you're gonna find for under not only $1,000, but under $700. And I think that's really saying something. Case finish is phenomenal, movement just does the job, 80-hour power reserve, dial finishing is great, and a wide variety to choose from. I think the PRX has just been a complete home run on all angles, and I think the enthusiast community has responded accordingly. I also was debating whether or not to put this watch on this list, but I thought better of it, and I think what we've seen from a feedback standpoint from the collector side as well as with the brand and its emergence, I think it was worthy, and that's the Tudor Black Bay. So with the why almost here, I think it really comes down to probably just too many variants. Has this one been played out or beaten to death a bit too much? Perhaps, but if you think about what this did for the brand Tudor, it's absolutely incredible. In a decade time, when this watch was announced, with the original ETA movement-powered variants in 2012, it's just completely been a barrage of new models and just success after success with the releases. Like the moving into their MT manufacturer calibers, which is a huge move for Tudor. Then moving into a true GMT movement in 2018, as well as with the Black Bay GMT being essentially setting the new standard for what that entry-level luxury GMT watch should be. Then you have the Black Bay 58s that took the storm in 2018 with many different variations to follow, different choices of material being used, including sterling silver, bronze, and we also have seen a full ceramic cased up Black Bay. The Black Bay, although maybe some are going to also say, I'd say this is another why almost, a little bit closely tied to Rolex, and some people might have an issue with that as well. It has helped establish that position of $3,000 to $4,000 as being a great point to sit when looking for your first luxury watch and getting a fantastic value in a brand that is delivering a really good product all around. For our next watch, we have the Seiko SKX009. So why almost here? I think it comes down to the fact that this one's discontinued, you have rising prices, and an obsolete movement. But adding this watch to the list here is not done just because of what the watch represents today for enthusiasts, but what it's represented for 2 decades, or more than that now, moving on 3 decades since its release in 1996. It's been an icon of affordability since that time, and at its height, it was available for around $150, give or take. And for those prices, this watch was legendary. Classic Seiko diver design with roots dating back to the 1960s and 70s in terms of where it was pulling from with its case and architecture. For years, it represented not just the entry-level affordable dive watch segment, but I also think it almost was that gateway drug into the world of collecting watches for so many. And with that considered, I think it has to be included on a list like this of just beloved icons of watchmaking. For our next watch, we have Grand Seiko with the SBGA 211, otherwise known as the Snowflake. Now the Snowflake, why almost? So I think some people are not gonna be crazy about the spring drive tech, but otherwise, this was the watch that put Grand Seiko on the map in terms of allowing it to expand in popularity, especially in different markets outside of Japan. Grand Seiko 10 years ago was a very different animal than it is today. It now operates as its own independent brand apart from the Seiko Corporation here, at least in the United States, with Grand Seiko USA being powerful and gaining market share fast for good reason. But the watch that was able to catch on and build that mystique first was the Snowflake. The story and imagery behind the Snowflake dial was enough to get everybody going, and then tying in the spring drive tech in it with its tri-synchro regulator, taking mechanical energy and utilizing a glide wheel for frictionless brake and going with an integrated circuit. I have a whole video talking about this, and the Snowflake was the model that was allowing this all to come together and for it really to stick like snow in the minds of enthusiasts. And for our last watch here, we have Patek Philippe with their chronographs and perpetual chronographs. Now this is more of a collection or type of watch style that I think is worthy of being mentioned in this list. Now why almost? I think it comes down to being cost prohibitive. These are expensive watches, some of the most collectible watches of all time. Patek's first chronograph was produced and sold in 1856, and they've maintained this storied history of chronograph production pretty much ever since. Contemporary Patek with its bicompax display has mostly been occupied by the 5070 and 5170, some of the most beautiful chronographs ever produced in my opinion, but really where I think Patek is unquestionable is with their calendar chronographs, with such models like the legendary 1518, a watch produced shortly after the Stern family's acquisition of the brand, or something like the 5970, which is probably one of my favorite watches ever. And despite these maybe being small for some, you also have the more modern options with the 5270. But when I think of Patek Philippe, I think of their calendar chronographs or chronographs. I think they helped lead the charge in dictating the design, specifically on the perpetual chronograph side of things. When I think of the layout of a perpetual chronograph, I think of what Patek Philippe was able to lay forth with their designs for decades and decades. But all right guys, that's all we have for this video. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Do you agree with my picks? Do you disagree with my picks? What watches would you include that were not included here? Did you not agree with one of my choices? I'd love to see comments down below as well and hear what you all have to say about this. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.